Welcome everyone to the Bren School Abalone Symposium, an afternoon of presentations and discussions related to the potential. Can't hear? All right, I will project my voice louder. Is that okay? Better? Okay, so there are two mics. If you choose to use the mic that projects your voice, we can hook you up for that. Or you can just speak at normal volume. This is recording, so everybody that wants to speak is going to either use this or one of these. It won't actually project your voice, but we're going to have a video of the whole symposium. So, and then we're also having a couple of these float around the audience for the Q&A sections. So, okay. So everybody can hear me if I speak this loudly? Yes? Okay, so sorry about the delay, but hopefully most people are here by now. Just a couple of quick notes. We're the Abalone group. My name is Ariel Jacobs, and I'm Heather Hodges.
Dan Ovando.
Kristen Bohr. Okay. We'd just like to take a quick moment to thank the Sustainable Fisheries Group. Their funding made this symposium possible. Also, please feel free to help yourselves to water. It's located up in the back corner of the room. Bathrooms are outside at the corner of the courtyard to the right. And yeah, so we're going to have an afternoon of presentations with some time after each presentation for questions. So, a quick overview of what the Bren School group does here. This is our capstone project, which serves as our master's thesis. It's a multidisciplinary program, with the goal of this project being to provide us with professional experience working with a third-party client, in this case the California Abalone Association. And the goal is to prepare us to work in the real world. So a little bit of background about this group project. The California Fish and Game Commission is considering opening a small-scale experimental abalone at San Miguel Island, and a co-managed commercial fishing cooperative is one potential method for management. So we're working with the CAA to evaluate the ecological sustainability and economic viability of a potential fishing cooperative. The purpose of this symposium is to share recent research, stimulate discussion, and gain information and insights pertaining to the potential San Miguel Island red abalone fishing cooperative. We realize that this is a somewhat contentious issue, so we're hoping that people can hold their questions until the end of each presentation, and we do have some time allotted for that. So here's a brief list of who's going to be speaking today. We have some really excellent people that we're excited to have here. Several people from UCSB, someone from World Wildlife Fund, and also someone from the CAA. And the list is also over here on the whiteboard. So again, presentations will be 12 to 14 minutes long, followed by a few minutes of discussion. And afterwards, we're going to have an informal reception up on Decker's Deck from 5 to 6 with some food and drinks for everyone. So thank you all for coming. And I'll be keeping time on a stopwatch and giving everyone a 4-minute and a 2-minute warning. So, anything I left out? All right, so I will let my colleagues take it away here with the first presentation. This is Dan and Heather.
Thank you. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Dan Ovando. This is Heather Hodges. And we have the somewhat dubious honor of kicking this thing off with our presentation, Cooperative Solutions to Common Pool Fisheries. So to begin with, why talk about cooperative fisheries? Many studies have documented the decline and even collapse of fisheries around the world in recent times. The tragedy of the commons is often implicated in this decline, in that it incentivizes fishers to catch as much as possible, as fast as possible, before their competitors do, creating an environment for unsustainable management. However, a growing number of papers have started to look for bright spots within the field of fisheries management. And one topic they've touched upon is this concept of catch-share fisheries, which basically provides a dedicated access to the fishery to a group of fishers, and in doing so, creates a financial incentive for sustainability. So what are cooperative fisheries? Cooperative fisheries are one form of these catch-share systems. While they take a variety of forms around the world, they're not always called cooperative fisheries, they share a common structure of bringing disparate groups of fishermen together into a common goal. As one fisherman put it to me, it basically takes fishers from moving from individual hunters to collective harvesters. And in doing so, it can help move the fishery from the race to fish by creating a common incentive structure whereby fishermen now try and maximize the revenue over time of their cooperative rather than maximizing their individual profits in the short term. However, in looking at these questions, it's vital to understand not just why they should work, but how they actually function, which is where our research comes in. For our research, we surveyed global fisheries around the world to see how individual communities responded to the incentives of cooperative management. Our result was in over 25 case studies of fisheries around the world that documented the operating environment in which the fishery managed itself, the internal management structure of their organization, and where possible, the economic and ecological performance of the fishery. So today what we'd like to do for you is walk you through 3 case studies that we've looked at and then talk through some of the broader issues that we came across for cooperative management in our research. First cooperative I'd like to talk to you about today is the New England Sector Management System. The sector management system was formed in response to declines in the New England groundfish stock, especially cod, which basically resulted in increased regulations, lower days at sea, a decreased total allowable catch, and generally a shorter season, all things that made small-scale fishermen uneconomically viable. They were basically getting run out of business. In response, this sector system was developed. Basically what the system does is allows fishermen to voluntarily form cooperative organizations, which in exchange for certain rights and responsibilities, grants them a dedicated access, a quota, to the fishery, which they may then decide how to fish. What's neat from a researcher's point of view about this system is that it's from a ground-up system, so fishermen are able to develop a system they feel works best for their individual fishing needs. From a researcher's point of view, this is interesting because it gives us a whole bunch of different management approaches within the different sectors to a similar challenge, aka how to manage their fishery. So a couple interesting things we came up with in here is that different fisheries had developed innovative means for distributing the catch among their members. Some assigned transferable quotas, some simply split it between their members. They also developed individual methods for including enforcement and getting liability within their members. And they also developed some methods for sustainability, finding methods to prevent themselves from catching over their total allowable catch for the year. So how has the system performed? From the fisher's point of view, one of the most important facts has been that it's allowed them to spread their fishing effort throughout the year for when it's most profitable for them. In addition, it's allowed them to target high-quality fish over catching large quantities in a short period. In doing so, it allows them a predictable stream of revenue which they can use for financial planning, and in doing so, allowing them to be economically viable and maintain their way of life. The next fishery that I'd like to talk about is a little bit different. It's the Challenger Scallop Enhancement Company of New Zealand. This cooperative was formed in 1994 in response to chronic declines in the scallop stock along the northern edge of New Zealand's southern island. In response to this collapse, the quota owners of the fishery decided to come together and manage the fishery cooperatively rather than competing individually for the same resource. The structure of this cooperative is very different from the sector system we just discussed. It's a much more corporate style in a way. They operate on a shareholder voting basis in which members with more quota have more votes at the cooperative table. However, their actual decisions are made in a much more collaborative fashion. In many of their decisions, they take it in a kind of round table fashion to the community at large. They meet with environmental groups, scientists, government agencies, and the recreational component to talk about their management options for the fishery, toss some ideas back and forth, and then use these to incorporate into their actual management plan. One concept they've come up with through this is this idea of rotational harvesting. Basically what they do is they take the bay in which they operate and they divide it into a number of zones. They then rotate harvest throughout these zones each year, allowing a portion of the fishery to remain closed each year. In addition, if a section of the fishery or zone is found to be depleted or at risk of depletion, they leave it closed until some form of recovery is seen there. One of the most important things to come out of this cooperative has been the development of extremely high-resolution scientific data on the fishery. As the cooperative got moving, they realized they needed much more data on how the ecology of the system actually worked and what the status of the stock was. As such, they've worked with environmental groups and scientists and other third parties to really expand their knowledge of the fishery. They've even gone so far as to buy a research vessel which they use for this purpose. In addition, what they found is that while their expenditures for environmental research have remained fairly constant over time, the quality of the data they're receiving appears to have gone up, which implies that their efficiency has gotten greater over time. As a result of this, their annual yields on average have increased since the start of the cooperative. They've now become over a multi-million-dollar business and recently grossing over $10 million in a single year. However, recently there has been a bit of a decline in the scallop stock out there. What's interesting about that, though, is that even in the face of these declining profits, they've maintained their closure system and kept parts of the fishery closed off and recovering, even though they could definitely use a little bit more catch.
All right, the last case study we're going to review today is the Western Abalone Divers Association. This takes place in Victoria. There's 3 zones, and the WADA is one of those. In response to recent microstock collapses, they have imposed a new management system, so we're going to look at that. As most of you probably know, Australia is the largest abalone producer in the world, and the catches maintained relatively stable in recent years despite collapses elsewhere. However, they are finding that there are losses in production on specific reefs throughout many of the zones, and subsequently the total allowable commercial catches have decreased over time. Historically, the stocks in Australia have been managed through legal minimum lengths and total allowable commercial catches, and furthermore, the industry has taken a very proactive approach and has actually looked to reduce pressure on the resource by literally reducing their membership. So in 1968, they had 164 members, and they used a license transfer system to reduce that number to 71. This did decrease pressure on the stock, and now those licenses closely resemble an individual transferable quota system. So you have fishermen who have quotas who actually dive, you have divers who lease quotas, and then you have quota owners who no longer dive. However, despite these proactive attempts made on both sides, this hasn't prevented collapse of microstocks because abalone is a very unique organism. So they took into account this 3-part management system starting in 2002, which includes the first being a rapid visual assessment, where literally they use surveys and they use interviews to determine, based on shell characteristics, what the approximate abundance and size structure is at each microstock, which is also called a reef code. Then they use that in part with catch trends and effort data to determine what category each reef code falls under, where category 8 is being the least exploited. And finally, they take these and they appropriately apply voluntary minimum lengths. And then they devise a harvest plan that is appropriate to the entire group of reefs so that some will recover while others will at the same time not be over-harvested in response. Although this has only been in place for approximately 7 years, there's already been some evidence of successful results. For example, the fishermen were initially very suspicious of this cooperative arrangement, but one of their most productive but recently collapsed reefs was actually recovering in that time, so they're very happy about that. Furthermore, they have actually formed a memorandum of understanding with government officials, so now those voluntary arrangements, those voluntary minimum lengths, are actually enforceable, legally enforceable. This has resulted in a 95% compliance, and it's increased collaboration with scientists and agencies. And in regards to that, there are multiple other zones within Australia that are actually following suit. Throughout Dan and I's research, we found that there were many cases where cooperatives had recurring themes or similar structures, and we want to look at those in a little bit more detail. So next 3 slides are going to get into that in a little more detail. The first, many cooperatives use coordinating marketing as a tool to refine their management structure. This allows the fisheries to operate with prearranged prices and volumes and creates an incentive for high quality over quantity, like Dan already discussed. Furthermore, this provides communities with a very predictable and management stream of revenue and allows the fishermen to consolidate their effort, further increasing their revenue. Secondly, collaborative research is also a recurring theme. We found that there's cooperatives create an incentive for joint research between fishers and scientists, and this results in the acquisition of high-resolution data on local ecosystems. By placing control in the hands of the fishermen, you have an incentive to develop efficient and appropriate management tools and grow mutual trust between the fishing, scientific, and regulatory communities, which is a huge bonus. And finally, many of you probably wonder, is there any benefit to the resource if you have a cooperative? And in many of the case studies we looked at, that was the case. There were reductions of vessels in the water, and furthermore, increased sustainability through voluntary closures, stock enhancement, and self-imposed quotas and size limits. So it can be helpful in many cases.
So in considering the implementation of the use of a cooperative fishery, there are a number of challenges which should definitely be addressed. From a researcher's perspective, one thing we came across is that while the successes of cooperatives were widely reported, failed cooperatives tended to go undocumented, meaning there's not a whole lot of information if one didn't work, why that happened. From a manager's point of view, this is extremely important information to figure out what actually makes a successful cooperative or a failed cooperative. One thing that we did look at was the issue of targeted species. We found that many of the cooperatives that are more successful looked at more sessile or localized species for their harvest. Cooperatives that tended to struggle more were those that went after highly migratory or very dispersed species. Geography played a similar role in that. We found that cooperatives that operated in an area where they could draw a nice clear line around their fishery, like a cove, a bay, an island, a single village along a stretch of coast, tended to be able to more efficiently create a cooperative. Whereas those that operated in a more complicated environment, say a bunch of different fishing villages along a common stretch of water, had a much more difficult time setting up a cooperative structure. We also looked at the need for clearly defined and secure access to the fishery. What we found was that fishers needed to be secure that so long as they went along with the understanding they have with government officials, that their investment would be there in the future. But on the other hand, we found that fishers that were unsure that even if they did everything they could do, their access to the fishery would be maintained, were hesitant to invest in sustainability because they weren't sure if they were going to be able to fish in the future and recoup their investment. Lastly is the challenging issue of equitable access among community members to the resource. In setting up a dedicated access fishery, it becomes very difficult in some instances to balance the need for providing fair access to the resource between maximizing the efficiency of the cooperative. And as we talked about today, many of our cooperatives use different approaches to that. You see the sector system, which utilized a much more kind of community-based method and in order to keep people just in business, versus the challenger model, which is very efficient and created a lot of profits, but did concentrate the fishery into fewer hands. So in conclusion, we hope that our presentation gave you a better idea of what cooperative fisheries are, how they function, and what kind of effects they can have. Our research does show that given the opportunity, fishing communities are able to develop effective solutions to the local challenges of managing their individual fisheries. And in doing so, they can provide ecological and economic benefits and provide a tool for sustainable marine resource management. Thank you very much. We'd like to thank especially the Sustainable Fisheries Group and the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation, as well as Dr. Chris Costello, the California Abalone Association, Dr. Jeremy Prince, Russ Mincher, and Eric Brazier. Any questions? So hang on a sec, we're going to get some mics going here. To start off.
How about poaching? How does that affect cooperatives?
It definitely affects it in a large way. This kind of goes back to the question was, how does poaching affect cooperative performance? We definitely came across that a few times, and it kind of ties back into that geographic issue that I mentioned. A large reason why cooperatives are more successful in the more geographically isolated areas, they were more effectively able to patrol their area and really mark it off. You know, this line in the water is kind of where we operate. Whereas when you had a lot of different people around there, there definitely was a problem with poaching, people coming across the border there. So it really does play a factor into the cooperative structure. However, we did also find with the cooperative, a lot of times there's a lot of self-enforcement. They'll have people out at night, kind of walking around the place, so it can really enforce the eyes on the water looking for that kind of activity.
So you started by saying that you did a synthesis of 25 case studies, 25 examples that you were able to look at, and then you said these three that were very encouraging. How many of the 25 are characterized as similarly encouraging, accepting what you said about failures being hard to discover? But how representative are those three of that survey that you did, or are there a fair number of failures within that 25?
You want to take that one?
Yeah, I think that's what was really actually exciting about our research is we found it didn't matter where these cooperatives were taking place, whether they were in India or the South Pacific or North America. They had really similar success stories. And granted, like you said, I mean, the failures are out there and they're just less documented. But I thought that's what was great about it, is that it wasn't regardless of size or location or the membership involved. It seemed like they were still able to coordinate their efforts, coordinate the revenues, and increase sustainability. So
There were no failures?
no, there were. I specifically looked at a case in Mexico where essentially the failure on the part of the cooperative was due to poaching from an increased pressure from outside fisheries. So that was one example. We found a couple others.
Yeah, I came up with one situation where basically rather than relying on kind of ground-up methods for the creation of the cooperative, a government agency basically came in and put a cooperative in place, and it never really bought up with the community. No one really took charge of it, so it fizzled pretty quickly. So
Yeah.
there definitely were instances, but the majority followed this pattern.
With what you know about what we proposed,
I would say the current plan for the CAA falls very much in line with many of the successful cooperatives that we were able to see in terms of the target organism, the location of the fishery, and the ground-up level of commitment.
How much of the success or failure of a cooperative is due to the cooperative itself and its design, or due to simply the failure of the fishery? I'm thinking of New England
Mm-hmm.
in the 80s and 90s. They had cooperatives there.
Mm-hmm.
The cooperatives failed because the fishery was closed due to chronic overfishing.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't, that doesn't mean the cooperative failed. The whole fishery failed.
Mm-hmm.
So how much of the success or failure of a fishery can you lay at the feet of a
Yeah.
cooperative?
Absolutely. I think a lot of that, again, kind of ties to the species and geographic issues that we touched on. I think in the cases there, those cooperatives were not the only people harvesting that resource. There are a bunch of them. There's an open access fleet around it, so they don't really have a specific control over it. So in looking at the success or failure of a cooperative, it's very important to consider exactly those factors. Is there something else going on here? Some of the cooperatives in Chile, for example, are struggling with that issue right now. They're kind of unsure whether the successes or the failures are as much to do with the actions inside the cooperative or possibly larval dispersal or some other factors going on other reefs. So that's definitely an important area of ongoing research.
Yeah, in Europe, for example, there's been a lot of problems with when they've tried to start a cooperative because a lot of the stocks are migratory. They fall under varying countries' legal requirements, and then it's a whole legal fiasco and oftentimes ends up being shut down from that scenario. So that happens.
Yeah, they can take many different forms. We looked at both kinds, but yeah, you definitely raised a good point there.
Of the fisheries that you assessed, were there any that had a substantial recreational component? And if so, how was that recreational component mixed into the cooperative structure and allocation?
Yeah, I would say that the majority of the research we looked at didn't necessarily compare those side to side. I could note that specifically in Australia, there's a huge recreational component in multiple fisheries there, and those have come into play when you're talking about the cooperative arrangement and how to make it work side by side. But I haven't seen some really...
Some of the ones in New Zealand operate a lot with that challenge there, especially the POWA cooperatives down there and the challenge one we just touched on. What's interesting is a lot of them, in those two cases at least, operated under used a spatial technique to deal with that. So in the case of the POWA companies, the Abalone fishermen of New Zealand, they negotiated settlements with the recreational sector. They basically said, all right, you guys have these few reefs over here. We don't touch them. That's all you guys. And they kind of back out of that. Challenger, the scallop enhancement company looked at there, operates under a similar pattern.
To what extent did enforcement play in the success of the cooperatives? Either the self-enforcement, self-policing, or government enforcement? And can you differentiate between the two?
Yeah, I think I found that was huge, especially I looked a lot in different places in India, and that's been a big problem in that the government hasn't really jumped on board with the idea of all their cooperatives. So even though they're into it, they can only do so much enforcing on their own. And so I know that's been a problem there. And in other cases that we saw, it was often the times that, depending on how strong of punishment there is towards people who step outside lines of the cooperative, self-enforcing can be varied from that aspect. So you could actually have really strict regulations and people are scared not to adhere to them. Or if they're too light, then yeah, you do have the problem with even self-enforcing.
One of the more important points, potentially positive points of what we're thinking about doing here, is what you had mentioned earlier in your presentation, more eyes on the water. And the concept of budgets in California going to hell in a handbasket and will never come back, and everybody thinks they are the damn fools. So the idea is, to what extent does more eyes on the water really work? In other words, is this potential positive attribute realistic?
I would say our research definitely shows that it does. Again, just the amount of eyes in the water definitely increases, and the self-enforcement within the cooperative we found many times increased. In many instances, especially in New Zealand that I looked at, we saw cases where actually government expenditures on the cooperative went down a lot while individual costs borne by the cooperative did increase as they took on more of these measures. It's a challenging question in terms of actually measuring, has poaching gone down, has it gone up, that kind of issue. But many of the cooperatives that we looked at really did feel that it does work. For example, I know in some of the New Zealand cases they imposed voluntary minimum size limits on some of their reefs. And when they did spot checks later, distributors and stores, they found that there was a very high compliance rate with those regulations, even without all the people on the water per se.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this presentation. So thank you, Heather and Dan.
Thank you all.
Thank you.